Hey there. Russian and Turkish soldiers are now killing each other in Syria. Not directly in sort of one-on-one clashes yet, but I feel like that's something that could start happening pretty soon. And I don't feel like people are really coming to grips with the true horror of what is going on in Syria right now. Today, I'm going to do an unproduced video on the topic in three parts. First, we're going to talk about what's happening and why I see it as just so horrifically dangerous. Second off, we're going to go to the sort of I told you so part of the program. And then last, because the Syrian people always come last when we talk about Syria, we're going to talk about the unfolding humanitarian crisis and what the United States could conceivably do to stop this. As I've said at every point, of this series on Syria, the United States has much more power in the Syrian conflict than is acknowledged, and we could do much more for the Syrian people, but we won't. So let's start with the details. In 2015, the United States and Turkey created a jihadist enclave in the north of Syria in the Idlib province. As the war has developed since then, Idlib is now the only part of the country left that is controlled by anti-Assad jihadist rebels. There are large numbers of vulnerable, innocent people being killed in Idlib right now by Russian and Syrian airstrikes, but I do think it's important to emphasize that this Idlib area is controlled by al-Qaeda and groups that are affiliated with al-Qaeda. It is, in fact, a jihadi terrorist enclave, and it is not just Russian or Syrian propaganda to point this out. In fact, it's U.S. propaganda to sort of try to hedge that and talk about all the innocents in the hospitals, instead of the fact that this enclave has been actively shelling Aleppo for years now. In 2017 and 2018, because of the complete absence of leadership or sanity from the United States, Russia and Turkey started working together to try to arrive at a solution to the Syrian civil war. Part of this solution was to pour even more people into Idlib as the rebel enclaves in the rest of the country were done away with. It was obvious to most commentators from the start that Russia and the Assad regime would eventually want to go into Idlib, but because Turkey was so angry at the United States, justifiably angry at the United States over U.S. support of the Kurds, Turkey was willing to sort of poke the U.S. in the eye by dealing with Russia. And this had positive effects. The amount of people dying in the Syrian war has gone down. The war is essentially over. We all now know how it's going to end. This was a good thing. However, what Turkey did not fully think through was what would happen as the United States sort of fell further and further out of influence in the conflict. Russia and Turkey, which had a sort of common goal in making the United States look silly and sort of punishing the United States for things that it had done, they have that common goal that's been achieved. Now we have to deal with the fact that Russia supports the regime and Turkey supports what's left of the rebels. And those two interests are now clashing quite directly. On Tuesday, the 4th, we learned that 7 or 8 Turkish soldiers were killed by the Syrian army. So not killed directly by Russia, but by the Syrian army, which uses Russian planes and Russian pilots as its air force. Turkey did large-scale reprisals. I've seen that they killed 13 Syrian soldiers. I've also seen that they killed dozens of Syrian soldiers. So there's differing reports. So we've got elements, military elements that are Turkish and Russian fighting and killing each other in the Syrian battle space. I've also read somewhat conflicting and poorly fleshed out reports of a number of Russian and Turkish soldiers, no numbers attached to this, being killed somewhere else in northern Syria. So who knows? I mean, it's quite possible that there's already been conflict between Russian and Turkish soldiers that's now being covered up by both sides because they don't want to fully deal with the ramifications of that. So things are really beginning to fall apart. This is a quagmire that's developing, and as even this video will get into, there's a little bit of a, look, the Turks and the Russians are finally, getting into this quagmire, creating this problem. But I don't think that's a very intelligent way to look at this, A, because people are dying in large numbers, but also because of the extraordinary extraordinary risk of what we're seeing here. What we are seeing here is two top 20 economies, two of the largest industrial economic powers in the world, getting into a position where where their interests are clashing enough that military conflict between these two top 20 economies isn't just possible, it's kind of already happening. And that is a truly, truly horrifying prospect. It's sort of underappreciated how lucky we have been since the end of the Second World War. We're talking about a period of 75 years in world history where the wars have all been small. They've all been civil wars. They've all been wars where some vastly more powerful entity takes on a smaller entity, and sort of the boundaries of that war are, I mean, even the horrors of Vietnam or the invasion of Iraq. I mean, these are the multiple invasions of Afghanistan. These are conflicts that are bounded within national borders. You know, it's this country is being sacrificed to, you know, the military industrial complexes, to the interests of the Soviets versus the US. I mean, whatever. I mean, this one country is going to be horrifically beaten down, and these wars are terrible. But it's nothing like on the scale of great power wars. And that's what both, by the definition of sort of top 20 economies, both Russia and Turkey are great powers, by one definition. And the possibility of them getting into a real conflict is horrifying. Great power conflicts. Look, Syria is terrible. What's been going on in Syria is awful. We've got 500,000 people killed over the course of a decade, and it's extraordinarily tragic. In great power conflict, you can kill 500,000 people in a month. I'm not saying that's what's about to happen with Russia and Turkey, but that's what we're risking here. This channel and the rest of the news media, sort of at the beginning of this year, went into an incredible tailspin and panic over the prospect of the United States and Iran getting into a war. That is an awful thing. That is an awful prospect. But what's happening, what's unfolding in northern Syria right now is something we should be much, much more worried about. Iran does have capabilities. They can send missiles, they can disrupt the oil trade. They can do that sort of stuff. But the imbalance in power between the United States and Iran is so massive that even once a more involved conflict started, there would be this sort of intricate dance or complexity that would make it less damaging. The United States isn't really interested in destroying and occupying Iran. It's just not something it wants to do. Russia and Turkey are so powerful in that just their rubbing against each other in any kind of conventional warfare of any kind would have incredibly negative ramifications for the entire Black Sea area, the entire Middle East, potentially Europe as well, because Turkey is still a member of NATO. And that would require Europe and the United States getting dragged into this conflict. But even if that doesn't happen, the prospect of Russia and Turkey getting into a serious conflict, which seems to me quite possible, not likely yet, but possible, is terrifying. Really, I mean, just to emphasize this, top 20 economies getting into it, actually, getting in fights that lead to the death of soldiers is so incredibly rare since the end of World War II. The last time this happened was actually in 2015 when the Turkish forces shot down a Russian fighter jet. And before that, before 2015, I think we got to go back to 1960 or 1961 when the Soviets shot down a U.S. spy plane. I mean, this is just not something that happens. And now it's something that we've almost become used to in northern Syria. And the potential for escalation here is terrifying. This is something that we should be paying more attention to than we pay to Iran, because this could escalate. And it has escalated back in 2015 when the Turks shot down a Russian fighter plane. At that point, I mean, who knows? It ended up that Russia and Turkey sort of decided that their interests in Syria were more aligned than they thought. after the horror of like, oh wow, we could have a great power war back in 2015, but that's now falling apart. And that's something we should all pay a little more attention to, and it's something that is really quite horrifying. So now we come to the I told you so part of the program. In October of 2019, when Turkey launched another incursion into northern Syria, the world went nuts. The US media, the European media, just went crazy, condemned it massively. I, however, saw it as kind of a masterstroke. It sort of accomplished a lot of Turkey's goals very quickly. By invading northern Syria, Erdogan sort of forced a deal between Assad and the Kurds that controlled those sections of northern Syria and got the Assad regime, back into northern Syria. With just that one move, Erdogan had essentially guaranteed that there would be no Kurdish state in northern Syria. So that was tremendously well done. And what I said at that point was like, okay, he's gotten everything he can possibly get out of this. The most sensible thing to do at this point would be to declare victory and withdraw. And since then, it's the Turks have just continued to dig in northern Syria, and the disasters are mounting. We've got 8 soldiers killed this week. It could become a weekly thing now. I mean, who knows? That's probably unlikely. I think now that Assad and Russia have taken the sort of M5 highway, it's possible that they'll, kick back for another couple months, but it will only be for another couple months. I mean, at this point, Assad and Russia just want to keep going and want to consolidate a Syria free of outside influence. So that's something that's inevitably going to happen again, even if the current offensive in Idlib dies down. This is becoming a quagmire. Erdogan, the Turks really need to get out and find a way to sort of get out. The problem, of course, is they're so overcommitted to the Syrian jihadists, which the U.S. doesn't really support anymore, even though we convinced Turkey to create this monster. Obviously it's not as simple as Turkey just being able to pull out, but they should be looking for reasons to pull out, not reinforcing, which is what they're doing right now in response to their soldiers dying. The quagmire that I talked about in a video a couple months back is now developing for the Russians, for the Turks. I think I saw some very excited tweets about talking about what this might mean for domestic Turkish politics. Some people saying, well, the AK party, Erdogan's party that has sort of supported him, I guess from the early 2000s, in almost 2 decades now, his party is in danger of splitting, and this failure in northern Syria, which is going to just continue ballooning, it's possible, the deaths of those Turkish soldiers make it possibly more likely that his party will split and Erdogan's power could disintegrate. I think that's a little. I think you're getting a little ahead of yourselves there, but that's the dynamic that this is accelerating. And it's nice to see things go badly for Erdogan, but it is not nice to see things go badly for Turkey, and it is a little horrifying, the prospect that this presents, the prospect of real conflict between Russia and Turkey. As far as Washington, D.C., in Washington, D.C., there's been this sort of very, excited, panicked talk about the emerging Russia-Turkey axis, this alliance of dictators and Erdogan and Putin, and they're coming for us. And as longtime viewers of this channel know, I've always laughed that off as just hilarious warmongering horseshit. There'll be a link above my head, no doubt. The idea that Russia and Turkey were going to form some kind of long-term, alliance against U.S. interests was always absurd. It was only the just mind-blowing idiocy of Washington, D.C.'s policy in Syria under Obama and Trump that allowed them to briefly form a sort of alliance of interests. And that brief alliance of interests is now quite clearly disintegrating. I mean, I'm not saying that, a couple months from now we might have, more smiley-faced meetings between Putin and Erdogan, and everyone in Washington D.C. flipping out about, and how did we lose Turkey or whatever? Because that's how dumb Washington D.C. is. Just, I think you should remember that the next time you see a news article like that, remember that Russian and Turkish troops are facing each other along front lines in northern Syria, and their troops are dying. So I think this really neatly skewers the absurdity of that whole narrative that Turkey and Russia are getting together to fight us. That's just simply not something that's not happening. So I told you so. Beyond that, just the insanity of Washington D.C.'s continued approach to this conflict is mind-blowing. This is a conflict that we created, that the United States created with its funding, with its dictates, with its encouraging its allies to create this absurd jihadist free-for-all in northern Syria that created the Islamic State, among many other ills. And it's just insane that there are large sections of the U.S. government that are dedicated to maintaining this rebel jihadi enclave in Idlib. And it's great because nobody really pays attention to this conflict. And when they do, you can say, oh God, look at these poor jeopardized civilians in Idlib. And you know what? There are poor jeopardized civilians in Idlib, and it's horrible. But the reason that there are poor jeopardized civilians in Idlib is U.S. policy. And the reason that their suffering and their agony is continuing is U.S. policy. But that's not something that they'll tell you in the New York Times or the Washington Post. It's incredibly frustrating. And now lastly, let's talk about the tragedy that is affecting the many innocent people of Idlib. We'll talk about it last because, as I said, the Syrian people always come last in these kinds of discussions. What's going on in Idlib is, I think, more horrible than what has happened in other places, mostly because they are the last folks standing in Ghouta, in Aleppo, in all of these other places that we've been told to pay attention to, where the Assad regime has been brutalizing, civilians, while fighting jihadi terrorists. But they have been brutalizing civilians. In all these other places, there were outlets. There was the ability to, through agreements between Russia and Turkey, get on buses and go somewhere else. Idlib is where that last refuge was. So yes, there are, lots of folks fighting. The folks who went there decided to be dead enders, but these were also a lot of fighters that took their wives and children with them. So even if, as I think in the United States, I'm about as extreme a sort of anti-Idlib person as you'll find, even with that, we've got to understand that there are women and children and families and elderly people suffering here who are there through no fault of their own, just by being attached to either, Idlib, they're from there initially, or being attached to some fighter. And it's a horrific, horrific situation. The outlets didn't exist. It don't exist anymore. Idlib used to be the outlet. And the ability to become a refugee is now much more clamped down. Turkey has more or less full control of that border to some rather serious depth into Syria. The folks that flee Idlib really can just go to this Turkish-occupied area of Syria, and there are camps and more camps being built there, but it's an area that is chock full of people now, and Turkey is looking at ways to force the Syrian refugees it already has. Turkey has somewhere between 3 and 4 million Syrians living on its soil. Now that the Turkish economy is no longer going gangbusters, they're now looking to force out more of their refugees into that pocket of northern Syria that they control. So there is almost nowhere for these sort of suffering innocents of Idlib to go anymore, and it is quite a horrifying situation. We should not minimize that, but I personally want the rest of Idlib to be conquered. I want this horrific agony to end. And that's the thing to realize about a lot of the people sort of crying crocodile tears about the people about the innocence of Idlib. And I refer to all of U.S. media, most European media as well, is what they're doing by saying, "Oh no, we must look after them. We must try to save this pocket." What they're trying to say is we must prolong the war. That's what they want to do fundamentally, and it's this fundamental inability to concede the fact that when Russia decided to go whole hog in supporting its ally in Syria in 2015, pretty much at that point, the war was over. It's only become more and more clear. I have seen the Syrian war as being essentially over since 2018. I mean, when the rebel areas of the south were quickly evaporated, at that point it became clear to me that it was only a matter of time. And what should have happened in 2018 was real negotiations with the regime should have started. That has not started. While I think the public face of U.S. and European approaches to this is no longer Assad must go, we won't talk to Assad, that's still functionally what it is. There's, I believe, limited humanitarian assistance through the United Nations going to some Assad-occupied territories, but the vast majority of U.S. and European aid for humanitarian purposes is being poured into places like this Idlib pocket. We're giving this Idlib pocket the resources it needs to continue fighting. Even though we're supposedly no longer giving them arms, we are keeping them fed, we are keeping them supplied. So it's this really messed up thing where you have a whole bunch of people. You can look at the op-eds of the Washington Post and the New York Times this week, where there are these people who are like, "Oh, we really care about the people of Idlib and these poor, suffering Syrian people. So what we have to do is take more actions that keep the Syrian civil war going." And that's just an absurdity. In my video a year and a half ago, talking about how the war was ended and how we can actually help the people of Syria, the people, the displaced people in Syria today, the Syrian refugees everywhere, is by beginning to talk with the Syrian regime. It is now clear that we are not going to, mostly because the US public and the European public is not as interested in working with jihadists as the US government and the European governments are. We are not going to be able, because the public keeps the U.S. government from supporting terrorism, essentially, but from supporting al-Qaeda. Because the U.S. public refuses to let the U.S. government work with al-Qaeda, we are not going to be able to overthrow Assad. That's not something that is possible any longer. I think that's a good thing. But the U.S. government hasn't quite absorbed this yet. So we're still funneling humanitarian stuff to al-Qaeda and their allies in northern Idlib and refusing to deal with Assad on any level. The sanctions against Syria are very extreme. This is against the Syrian government and the Syrian people that now control the vast majority of Syria. This is a place that was destroyed by war, and the U.S. is now doing everything in its power to make sure that it can't rebuild. This is insane. Is Assad a good person? Absolutely not. He's horrible. He's a horrific person. One of the really horrific things that he's doing right now is working to punish refugees who may come back. I've read a lot of reporting, and I think it seems credible that he's attempting to permanently alter the ethnic and sectarian makeup of the country. Many of the refugees are Sunni. The majority of them are, as the majority of Syrians are Sunni. So it's possible that he could be working to keep them out of the country permanently, or keep those that come back marginalized. And the United States government is helping him do this. Syria desperately needs money. It's going to need tens to possibly hundreds, I think that's probably exaggerated, of billions of dollars to rebuild. Iran doesn't have that kind of money. Russia doesn't have that kind of money. The West does. The United States does. It's now time to use the tools that have actually created ends of dictatorships across Eastern Europe, Asia, Latin America, whatnot. It is now time to deal with Assad. Reconstruction funds must be provided to Syria. If you are truly interested in saving and helping the Syrian people, then we have to help Syria rebuild. And unfortunately, that has to happen through Assad. So what needs to be done is there needs to be serious deal-making and serious approach to the question of Assad's repatriating of refugees and mercy or the appropriate approach that Assad will take to those displaced people in Idlib in northern Syria. And we can very much dictate that with the terms that our money comes with. It will be tremendously more effective against death and destruction if the United States is willing to negotiate with Assad and simply say that reconstruction funds are yours for the taking as long as you adopt certain protections for refugees. These protections can be monitored. These things can be looked after. It is so doable. It's been doable for years. I proposed this solution in my video on the end of the Syrian war 1.5 years ago. We absolutely can save the people of Syria, including the people trapped in this sort of jihadi pocket in Idlib. We can totally do this. We have been more than capable of doing this for years. The United States is still the most powerful element in deciding what happens in Syria. And at this point, the Washington Post is suggesting more sanctions. We're just going to sanction them harder, which will, of course, lead to the horrific death of more Syrians, whether it's by bombing or starvation. So this is a frustrating topic, and that's what I have to say about it. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And gosh, this is now the 25th video in my Syria series. Most of them are much more produced than this. And if you want to get a sense of what's really going on in Syria and what has been going on, I think watching that playlist would be very helpful. So maybe give it a look. Thanks.